2 Samuel 6, 1 Chronicles 13 and 15, and Psalm 132. There's a lot of passages today. What it means is this was a major event, and so it's covered in multiple ways in the Old Testament. And this is when David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. So this is very symbolic that Jerusalem now is the city of David, and now the worship of Yahweh, the one true God, is going to take place in Jerusalem. And what's amazing about this, of course, is some of you may be familiar with this account, they don't do it right the first time. And there's some death that takes place because they don't do it right the first time in the way they treat God's gifts. So we'll look at that in a second. But this is a major event, so it's treated in Christian art also. So again, if you have your Bibles with you, I will project. I have these texts up on your screen, and I'm going to jump between them a little bit because Chronicles and Samuel are parallel accounts, and they kind of supplement the other and give us information that the other one doesn't have. So I will be doing that. But let's look a little bit at how this has been portrayed. So going all the way back to the Middle Ages, this is a medieval manuscript from the 1400s showing David and the Ark of the Covenant. And so on the top there, David's giving a direction on how to bring in the Ark of the Covenant. And then on the bottom, you see the lyre and other musical instruments. That's actually an oud or a lute. Right on the bottom there, they probably wouldn't have had that same sort of lute, but they did have stringed instruments of many kinds. And then you have a harp, which are mentioned, or lyres, and the Ark of the Covenant being carried there. So that's in a medieval illuminated manuscript. This is from an illustrated Bible during the 1700s. So there's David playing a harp, and there's kind of a serpent horn instrument in the back. There are trumpets that are mentioned, as are tambourines, and you also see some sacrifices being gathered in the bottom of that, and the Ark of the Covenant in the back there being carried by the Levites. This is another take. It's a little harder to see because there's just a mass of individuals going on. It's kind of a fantastical or stylized version of this coming from the Baroque era. So the Baroque era of art, everything's in motion, right? So there's just a lot going on in Baroque art. And so David's center there with a robe and a crown, I'm just going to move my mouse around him, playing the harp. And then again, the Levites are in the back carrying the Ark of the Covenant with the cherubim surrounding the mercy seat. And that's where God's presence was said to dwell. And then on the far left, you see an animal sacrifice that's going on, again, showing you the account as it moves forward. Here we have another illustrated woodcut Bible illustration of David, again, leading the charge. In this one, he's dancing a little bit more. He's got the flowing robe, and you've got all the musical instruments, the double flute, right, which is an aulos. That was more of a Greek instrument later on. But again, percussion instruments, brass instruments, stringed instruments, as they celebrate the bringing in of the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. So, I mean, this was a big one for artists to show off because it takes a huge chunk of text in the Old Testament. So we're going to look at that text in just a second. And this was my background there. It's actually, we don't know who painted this. It just says an Italian master. Okay, an Italian master from the 1600s. But again, that's a really clear take on this, where you have the Ark of the Covenant carried on poles by hand, which is what they're supposed to do. You have on the left side here, you have a priest with a knife getting ready to sacrifice. You have David out here in the front, and then other musicians, and then other of just the people processing, including a young child, as they bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. So again, this shows you much artwork being shown in this passage that we see. And so I'm going to kind of go back and forth between Chronicles and Samuel to show you how this is illustrated. So to give you to refresh ourselves a little bit, in First Chronicles, we get kind of the macro view of everything. So we get genealogies, we get what family did what, we get kind of like the order array of the troops and how many thousands come from which tribe. We have the names and the lineage of all the priests. We have the name and the lineage of all the musicians. And so First Chronicles has this macro view where they're giving you all the details and kind of how all this, kind of went through history. Second Samuel is more of just that narrative. It's a story, right? It's just giving you that historical narrative. Between the two of them, we get a pretty good picture of what's going on during this passage. So I'm going to follow 2 Samuel for the narrative, but First Chronicles to just give you kind of that outside look on what's happening when David brings the ark. So let's look at this. First Chronicles 13 is how this starts, but in my slides that I'm presenting to you, you'll see I switch between the two. Okay, and that's on purpose, so you can see how this narrative unfolds. Every once in a while, something will kind of repeat itself because the chronicler had access to the scroll of Samuel. And so they use that scroll sometimes in their narrative. So here we go. So First Chronicles starting in chapter 13. David consulted with the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you and from the Lord our God, let us send abroad to our brothers who remain in all the lands of Israel, as well as to the priests and Levites in the cities that have pasture lands, that they may be gathered to us. Then let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul. All the assembly agreed to do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. So David assembled all Israel from the Nile of Egypt to Lebo Hamath. That means at this time, Gaza, what we now call the Gaza Strip, was ruled by Israel, at least at this time, okay? To bring the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim. It's going to be called something different than Jearim, Kiriath Jearim. It's going to have a different name in Samuel, but it's the same place. And David and all Israel went up to Bala, that is to Kiriath Jearim, that belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord, who sits enthroned above the cherubim. So this is kind of the hot spot, the locus of God's presence, right? Because this is the covenant. The 10 Commandments are in the chest, the staff that budded in Egypt. There's a lot of stuff in this, some manna bread, right? Some other things. This is the symbol of God's covenant with his people, and God exists there. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio were driving the cart. And David and all Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets. David again, so that's how it starts out in Chronicles. This is how it unfolds in Samuel now, because you get a number. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned in the cherubim. So far the same. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. That word castanet, we actually don't know what that means. It's just a best guess of what it might be. It's a musical instrument that only appears here in all the whole Old Testament. So we said castanets, which are kind of like that Spanish instrument. We actually don't know. It's just our way of saying it's some percussion instrument. Okay, we have no idea. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So I'm going to stop right here. This is a passage that if you read it at a cursory glance, it seems almost arbitrary. It's like, look, it was just a reaction. What's going on? He's just trying to help God's ark. He wasn't, you do that. You're walking with somebody, you just catch them if they stumble, right? It's not like he's trying to so what's going on here? Well, there's a variety of things. I'm going to give you some answers. And so in this 2 Samuel commentary, it's actually really, really well done. But you also have on your outline there, on this carrying the ark on a new cart, this is verses 3-4. It says, presumably this refers to a ritually clean cart as the Philistines had done. But here's the thing. That was not the method the Lord had commanded his people to use. Rather, God's command was that the ark should be carried by the Levites using poles placed through rings on the sides of the ark. Okay, so in other words, they're doing this wrong on the outset, and these are the two people that are the most complicit in this. So, in the commentary on 2 Samuel, this is our Concordia commentary, it says they had transgressed God's commands in the Torah in three ways, okay? Number one, they were transporting the ark on a cart instead of carrying it by a hand on poles. That's what your outline says for you there. They were taking charge of the procession, although they were Judahites, not a certain branch of the Levites who had been given that privilege. So that's another violation. Okay, that's the second violation. And third, Uzzah touched the ark, even though the Levites were not even allowed to touch it. They must not touch the holy things lest they die. So you have three violations. Okay, this wasn't just, so by the fact that they were transporting it the way they were already was already treating God's law loosely, okay? Second of all, the fact that there were Judaites leading this procession was also wrong. It was supposed to be a certain tribe in the tribe of Levi, so we got another problem. And then, of course, you're actually physically contacting this place that was holy, and you yourself are not holy. So you have three violations of this that's going on. This is not arbitrary on God's part. The second part of this that's weird is David's anger. Who is he actually angry at? You read this text and you're like, well, is David mad at God? The answer is that the text doesn't say that. Who is he angry at? He could be angry at a variety of different things. Okay, so again, the author states that David was angry because of Yahweh's outburst. That's the literal translation. Okay, David's anger was probably directed at the human mistakes that were made in transporting the ark. He was infuriated by the lack of obedience to the instructions Moses had given. The ire included those, like Ahio and Uzzah, who took charge of the ark's passage and allowed such laxity. It also could have been directed at himself for allowing it to happen. Oh, I was not paying attention. So he feels mad at himself for allowing this to kind of slip through his fingers. He was not being on top of things like he should. And he's mad at the circumstance. He's not mad at God. Okay, so when you read this passage, so both of those passages, whether it's the striking down of Uzzah or David himself being angry, they're often misread or misinterpreted. So I thought that would be helpful for you to pause there for a second and see what in the world's going on as this is transported. So there you go. So that's the way our own Concordia guy, Steinman, talks about this, and I think it was very helpful. So I wanted you to hear that. Yeah, go ahead.
So they would have had instructions, though.
Yeah, they knew.
To do this.
Right. They just thought they were going to do it this way.
Okay.
And so they just thought that this was more, who knows, maybe they thought it was more efficient. Maybe they thought it was still honoring because it was a brand new cart. And the Philistines had done that in 1 Samuel when they give the ark back. Remember, they're getting cancer or the plague or something. They have tumors, is how it's described, baubles. And then God, because they tried to take the ark and then Dagon falls down, when they give it back to the Israelites in 1 Samuel, they use a cart, and it's a ritually clean cart. There hasn't been any other animals on it or anything. It's the only thing that transported the ark. And so it could be also that the Israelites were like, well, that's what they did. So, and that works. So maybe we can do it too, or something. Could have just been pragmatism. You know, we don't get all the reasons why, but certainly they knew better. Certainly the Levites knew better, and certainly David knew better, hence his anger, right? And so that's the actions having consequence. And the application for us, if you want a law point from this passage, how do we teach? How do we treat God's sacred things? Right? How do we treat things like Holy Communion, baptism, the Word of God? Do we treat it with respect and reverence, or do we just kind of throw it away and it just falls on the floor and we don't really care? You know what I mean? That's one thing just to think about. Just now, again, I'm not saying we need to live like the Old Testament Israelites, but if there's a law point in this, that might be one of the law points. If you had to preach a sermon on this, right? How do we treat God's holy things? Right? And think about this one. If you really want to get something that's going to really challenge you, Paul says that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. How do you treat your body? Because if God now dwells within you, right? Because all of us have the gift of the Holy Spirit. How's that going? So if you want a law, there's a couple of law points here. If you think about it, right? You can apply this even in the new covenant. So I'm not going to end there, by the way. I'm just saying, if you want a law point there's a couple things there you can think about with Paul. It's in the epistle to the Corinthians. All right, we'll keep going. And David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now, Obed-Edom, or Obed-Edom, you can say it both ways. He's interesting because he's called a Gittite. A Gittite is somebody from the Philistine city of Gath. So there's a couple of so if you read commentaries on this, or if you read whether it's the Steinman one or study Bibles, so is this a foreigner that has the ark? Because David's like, this is too challenging for me. Let's just give it to the foreigner, see what happens. I don't really care about this covenant guy. So is David being glib and just saying, let the foreigners have it, and if they face the consequences? Maybe. Is he a proselyte? Maybe he's from Gath, but he became a member of Israelites' covenant community. I actually happen to think that's the most likely because he's living in Israel. Or is it some combination? And so who is this guy? We don't know much about it, but all we know is that God blesses this family because that's where the presence of the ark is. And God's showing us like, no, David, it's not that you were doing everything wrong. It's how you were doing it, right? It's not that your desires weren't necessarily evil, but how you accomplish those things matter, right? It's both matter, by the way. When people say, what matters more, the journey or the destination? The answer is both. Both. The postmodern answer is it's all about the journey. It's like, well, where are you headed? You know, like that sort of thing. If you're driving off like Pastor Dinger said this morning, if you're driving a car at 100 miles an hour and off a cliff, your destination kind of matters, right? However, how you get there matters too, right? So it's a both and, not an either or. So it's not that David was necessarily evil in his desires. It was just how it was accomplished. Treating God's holy things glibly was the problem. So God blesses this family's household. So I happen to agree with the commentators that think this is a guy who was probably originally a foreigner, or his family was originally foreigner, but now they're dwelling in Israel as believers in Yahweh. They're proselytes. They've joined. Even when Moses comes into the promised land and then Moses dies and Joshua leads them the rest of the way, there's a great number of foreigners with the Israelites. They're not all ethnically Jews or ethnically Hebrews, but they're believers in God. And so they go in. So Israel has proselytes. So this is almost certainly a proselyte, a member of that community that is being blessed here by hosting the ark, which is pretty incredible. David built a houses for himself in the city of David, and then he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, for the Lord had chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. And David assembled all Israel at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place, which he had prepared for it. And David gathered together the sons of Aaron and the Levites. And then what follows in the text, and I skipped that because I didn't want to copy them all over, is a list of all those families and all the heritage and all that list of Levites. I'm not saying that that's not unimportant, but for our study, that's not important. Okay, it's in the scriptures for a reason, because it shows that God is being faithful and there's a lineage and things are happening the way that God commanded. It also shows you how seriously the Israelites took their heritage. I mean, there's a lot of good things for that text to be there, but for us, I'm not including it. Okay, so anyways, you get that list, and now David's doing it the right way, is the point, right?
Aaron,
Yes, go for it.
It says he pitched a tent for it.
Yeah, it's like a replacement for the tabernacle.
No, I was gonna say, but was it the tabernacle? Basically?
It wouldn't be the tabernacle, but it would be a substitute for the tabernacle.
Same, built the same way.
Right. It roughly, yeah, we don't have, it doesn't give us that exact dimensions, but it's a temporary place because we're going to find out later, David's real heart is to build a temple.
Yeah.
Because he's going to make all the preparations and Solomon's going to go through with it, right? And so this is David's like temporary place for the ark in Jerusalem until there will be a temple, is the idea. So yes, but it's like the tabernacle. It's the special place for the ark. No, that's good clarification. Okay, then David summoned the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, and the Levites, Uriel, Asaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel, and Aminadab, and said to them, "You are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites. Consecrate yourselves, you and your brothers, so that you may bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place that I have prepared for it. Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, because we did not seek him according to the rule." So David figures it out. Did you catch this? This is why when we talk about David's angry, this is also why we need both books, First Chronicles and Second Samuel. If you have Second Samuel by itself, it's just, well, David's angry. But then you get First Chronicles, like, wait, he knows why this happened. So you get a little bit more detail. This is why it fills this in. Okay, and so David's doing it the right way. He's got the heads of the Levites. We're going to do this the right way. We're going to take this seriously. You guys need to consecrate yourselves. That usually meant ritual washings and anointings, right? Well, it could have been fasting. There's different ways of consecrating yourselves. You can read some of the stuff in Leviticus and Deuteronomy for that, but they had to consecrate themselves to make themselves prepared to carry it the right way this time. Okay, so that's the issue. David learned his lesson. And notice how active he is in the preparations. This isn't, oh yeah, those two guys, they got a new card. Okay, they're going to do it. This is, all right, Levites, pay attention. We got to do this the right way. He summons them and gives them commands. He's being very, very active as a leader now. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. David also commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as the singers, who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps and lyres and cymbals, to raise sounds of joy. And then I put in an asterisk, a list of musicians follow. Because in the Chronicles, that's what happens. You get a list of all the families and all the musicians. Why is that important? All these families are going to be connected to the future temple. So it shows that this continuous worship of Yahweh doesn't just start here, end here. It continues through the temple. So as they return from the exile in Babylon, right? They return 400s BC. They can look back at these genealogies and say, hey, we have a new temple now, a second temple. Hey, we need these families back, right? We know who they are. If your ancestor is one of these guys and you're in the tribe, hey, you should be a musician, or you should be a priest, or they actually had all this stuff. They kept these records with them during the exile. So that's why you have these lists in First Chronicles. So they had that for them. So they have a whole list of musicians. By the way, the composer Bach took two passages from this passage in Chronicles and copied them over and said, this is a really good philosophy of church music. I don't know if you're interested in that. He liked Chronicles, okay? It's not often that you hear musicians listed. That's why. So he kind of focused in on those. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. Okay, now we don't know why 6 steps. There's not anything more than this. It could have been symbolic of the days of creation, that God works for 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested, and so they do the sacrifice on the 7th day, in this case the 7th step, before they proceed. We know that the Jewish people were lovers of numerology, right, and seeing patterns and things, and so obviously 7 is a sacred number, right, and so we think that there's some symbolism there, but it's not specific. So if you read commentators, they'll say this is a guess. We think it might have been this day. We know there's some symbolism here. And if you look in the First Chronicles parallel passage, I have that listed on your screen, there are more sacrifices mentioned. But in the artwork that I showed you, they're zeroing in on this passage where you have an ox and a fattened animal. So you'll see 2 animals or 1 animal in almost all the artwork. That's because it's this passage that they're illustrating. David wearing a linen ephod here. This is interesting. There's some division in commentaries on this. Is he acting like he's a priest because the priests wore an ephod? However, this word can also just simply mean a linen undergarment. And it was tied at the waist with like kind of like a jacket over the top. So this may have happened during the summer because it's cooler to wear this. And so he would have been wearing just kind of like a whitish undergarment, right? Just kind of like a long undergarment robe. And then he would have had kind of something over the top of it, and it would have been tied at the waist. So some commentators say he was being priestly. Others say it was just simply standard dress for kind of like the middle or upper class of the day. There's not consensus on this. Okay, so the outline that I gave you, I think, does say he's being priestly. Let me just find this for you. Yeah, so it says 6:12 through 15 on your outline. It says David's ephod was the simple linen robe worn by priests. And so is he doing priestly things, is the implication. Yes, go for it.
Isn't there a passage someplace with David in it where he danced naked before the Lord?
Okay, so I'm going to explain that because that's where this is going to come from.
This would be a
This is
difference.
Yeah, so this is so when you hear that David danced naked, it's a sort of paraphrase of something that happens here. So we're going to get to that, okay? Because yeah, it's not quite accurate, but but you'll see what we mean, okay? And because it has to do with his wife from Saul's daughter, Michal. She's going to show up here, and she's not liking what she's saying. So that's it'll make sense when we get there. But here, yeah, what were you saying? Somebody else? Yeah, go ahead, Patty.
My footnote says that David said to have joined with the Levites wearing that linen ephod, which is a priestly vestment, because he's a unique king and a foreshadowing of Jesus,
Right.
Messiah, how he's priest and king. So in this, David was priest and king.
Yeah, acting because there's sacrifices going on, right? However, in this commentary, this is our Concordia commentary. This is what it says. It says, many have argued that the ephod signaled that David was acting as a priest. However, there is no explicit connection in the entire Old Testament between a plain linen ephod and the priesthood. Most references in the OT, Old Testament, to an ephod are the specifically made ephod for the high priest. Judging from the description of the high priest ephod, it was some type of long robe undergarment that was worn with an outer robe. Plain linen ephods are mentioned only in 1 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. The boy Samuel, a Levite but not a priest, wore a linen ephod while ministering in Yahweh's presence. The priests serving at the temple in Nob, who were slain by Saul, also wore linen ephods. Here, David wore an ephod. The common factor that unites Samuel, the priest of Nob, and David in wearing an ephod is that they were leaders in worship. And then he puts in italics, plain linen ephods appear to be vesture that could be worn by anyone other than the high priest, as he was leading or aiding in worship. As king, David was not acting as a priest. That is, he was not doing any acts specifically reserved for priests according to the Pentateuch. Instead, he was acting as God's designated king of the holy people, the chief lay worshiper before Yahweh. And so this is kind of like, it's sort of saying he's doing priestly things, but it has more to do with public worship, is why he's wearing this. It's kind of, so what he's going after, this is Andrew Steinman, and you can have your own opinion. This is an example where Christians can disagree and we can still be friends. Okay, because there's no consent. My point is there's no consensus. But in what, imagine, so when I am not an ordained clergy, okay? But when I lead at 8:30 worship, I still vest, right? My son, as an acolyte, when he does that, he actually puts a robe on and vests, but he's not a priest. You follow me on this? He's not the pastor.
Mhm.
So it's possible, what Steinman's going after here is it's possible that David, because he's leading a worship procession, is vesting. Do you get what I'm saying? Because he's leading the worship procession. That's what Steinman's saying. Now, is it true that all of Israel is supposed to act as priests? Yes. Is there such a thing as the priesthood of all believers? Yes. Does David do other things that are priestly in other passages? Yes. So I'm not trying to minimize that. And I think that that still could be a valid interpretation. But anyways, if you want to read the Steinman passage, he goes into why he takes that position in our commentary. That's why I brought the commentary today, because there's some stuff here that's a little tenuous interpretation. But I like what the commentary says here too, because as a type of David is certainly a Christ type. And so for him to actually be doing this as the king, because the king is still advocating for the people, the king is still priestly in that he intercesses for God in front of the people, right? And so there's some priestly stuff he does, he eats the showbread and other things in the previous book. So obviously I don't minimize that commentary either. I think that could be true too.
And they're both coming from Concordia Publishing House.
Right, which is interesting, right? So one's our study Bible and the others are commentary, and they have two different ways of looking at it. So does that give you an idea that even within our own synod, there's not unanimity on what's going on here? Okay. It's okay to admit that. Okay. I mean, it's important. It's either way, he's acting in a worship setting either way. Whether he's being priestly or he's being just the leader of public worship. Either way, that's why he's wearing this. Okay. However, because it's an undergarment and is it hot outside and he's not wearing all his kingly regalia. And this is an era before they had things like, underwear and long johns, right? And he's dancing with all his might. So keep that in mind. This is going to lead us to Ralph's question. Okay. All right, here we go. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, see, that sounds like a priest, right? So now you see why why the study Bible says what it says. He blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his own house. That's a rich feast in this culture, by the way. Meat was rare. You might have meat once a week, maybe, and it was usually fish. Okay. Raisins were sometimes in season, not in season, because it's dried grapes. And so depending on if you had access, right? Most people back then ate a lot of just bread or olives or, that sort of thing. It was or they ate off the land, right? Or they again had fish. So having this stuff all in at once, this is an abundant feast. Okay. And, if you had the right bread, the right meat, and the right type of raisins, you'd probably like that now, right? You can make a good raisin cake today. Who knows? And so the point is this is a feast, that it's a public ceremony, a public worship experience. So if you're somebody like Steinman, when he offers these sacrifices, I don't even have to read it. He's going to say, that doesn't mean David's literally doing the slaughtering. It just simply means he's leading the public worship. That's what Steinman's going to say. However, other commentators say, well, he's involved with it because he's the king. And, so again, that's where you don't have that consensus here. Now, 2 Samuel continues, and David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Okay, so this is an interesting passage. So you asked about David dancing naked. He's not naked. However, depending on how you translate the Hebrew passage, it says he may have exposed himself. She said this right here, right? How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants. So if I give this to you, let's see. I'm going to give you this. This is what the commentary says. Since all the people went to their homes, David also went home intending to bless his household. However, the narrative takes a different turn when Michal purposely comes out to criticize her husband. Her denunciation focused on what she perceived as David's lack of decorum. According to her, his dancing had exposed his genitals to everyone observing him, including the slave girls of his servants. Now, did that actually happen, or is that a rhetorical point by her? Like, is she being extreme? You know what I'm saying? Because he's wearing this linen ephod. Do you get what I'm saying? Is she just kind of like saying, By acting this way, you might as well have been naked. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah, go ahead.
Also, since he was wearing an undergarment rather than his kingly robes, that probably in her eyes demeaned him also.
Right.
And wearing his underwear, you might, yeah.
Go ahead.
It also occurs to me that it could have been, for lack of a better term, a wifely jealousy. You let them see you as I see you,
Right.
you know, exposed.
It could be, or again, or because her dad was the king, she's Saul's daughter. Maybe Saul was known for comporting himself as like this majestic figure, right? And so she thinks the king needs to act kingly. And because David was not acting kingly, she's like, you might as, that's why she's saying what she says. Because even so again, different commentators. So this is from the ESV study Bible, this one that I gave you. It's on the back side of your page here. Look what it says. It says, Michael accuses David of uncovering himself. Listen to what they say, which seems to be a reflection more of Michael's bitterness and contempt for David than a true statement of fact. So when somebody says, well, David danced naked, well, hold on. You see what I'm saying? Hold on. Because look who's the messenger. Look at the context of what's going on. And he is wearing a linen ephod. And this is not like wearing just a little pair of hates. This is a full body garment. Okay, do you get what I'm saying? So when somebody says that, say, wait a minute, find me that in scripture and explain it to me. Because most people that say that, I think it's one of those things that's kind of like in sort of like Christian pop culture that's just said and never actually read in the original. Like we say other things like that too, right? The most famous quotes that people think that are in the Bible, but they're not in the Bible. Right? That like the famous one, the Lord helps those who help themselves. Have you ever heard that? That's not in the Bible. But people think it's in the Bible, right? Or we paraphrase things. Like, for example, we always say to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord. That's actually not scripture, but it's summarizing something Paul says that's similar. And it does really capture the sense of what he says. And so when somebody says, well, David danced naked before God, so I can worship any way I want. It's like, hold on. Wait a minute. Go to that passage in 2 Samuel and explain to me what's going on. Yeah, go ahead.
I was also reading in the commentary on the ESV, they're pointing out that from Michael's perspective, her father was, very kingly and wore his robes and all these things.
Right.
Where David humbles himself by putting on just the ephod and the priestly robes.
Right.
Humbles himself before the Lord. And she finds that contemptible because that's not what her dad did.
Right. Because her dad was all about, I'm the best, I'm the greatest, I'm the most majestic. Saul is a pride problem, right? And so here's David acting with a simple linen ephod on, right? Dancing around. She's indignant, right? Saul would have never done that. A true king doesn't behave this way, right? Do you see what's really going on here? And so I would hesitate, and I recommend hesitating when people say, well, David danced naked. Wait, hold on. What is really going on in this passage? Because you can't get that from this text. At its most literal, because he's wearing that robe and there's nothing underneath that robe, as he's dancing, if you had the wrong point of view, maybe you caught a glimpse of something. But he's certainly not naked. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's a paraphrase, and it's a popular misunderstanding. And again, some commentators say that it's probably just her just going after him rhetorically a little bit, when it's actually probably not true. Because Jewish men, Jewish men do not want to be seen as uncovered. That's humiliating. In fact, that's one of the reasons the humiliation of the cross, that's an extra dimension to that, by the way, is the fact that Jesus is stripped down, right? We give him dignity when we do artwork, okay, for appropriateness, but he was almost certainly completely stripped down on the cross, okay? And for a Jewish man, that was absolute ritual humiliation. Jewish men would never do that. So that's another reason why, if you look at Jewish culture, now granted that's a little later, that's another reason we think that that's not what this really is. Okay, so there's a variety of different reasons. We're going to add, go ahead, Ralph.
I may be going over plowed ground, so forgive me. Michael became his wife by inheritance, so to speak, when he became king.
Yeah, so remember so David's anointed and Saul's trying to get rid of him. So to give you some background, so this is back in 1 Samuel, right? And so he says, whoever gives me this many foreskins of Philistines, remember that? They're going to bring him back and he can have my daughter in marriage. And David, it's double that amount. He brings them extra. And so then Michael's given to David in marriage. But then once David goes on the run, Saul actually gives Michael to somebody else. And so then in the succession dispute that takes place about 2 or 3 chapters earlier, he gets Michael back. in I think it's chapter 3 or chapter 4. You can look that up if you want. In 2 Samuel, he gets her back. So she's kind of an interesting person, but she apparently has no children, either with David or with this person that, I don't know, it's kind of an adulterous thing that Saul does with her, basically. But it's given back to David, but she never has kids. And that's, remember, God opens and closes the womb in the Old Testament, right? And so this is part of the curse of Saul, that Saul's daughter isn't having any kids. It's not that David, we have no indication that David like withdraws conjugal rights or anything like that to Michal here. We think that that's because God has closed her womb. Because number one, you see how she is, her personality a little bit, but also because she's Saul's daughter and God made that. Yeah, go ahead.
So I infer from this, perhaps incorrectly, but I infer from this that it may be that God closed her womb because she showed such disdain for the king.
Oh, yeah.
Her husband, and he said, I'm not bringing anybody in this line through you. You're
Right.
done.
Yeah, and it could be that her character, because God looks at the heart, right? That's actually Samuel, right? 1 Samuel, right? That's when Samuel anoints David, right? In 1 Samuel, man looks at outward appearances, but God looks at the heart, right? That's one of the most famous quotes from all of this. So God knows Michael's heart. He knows who she really is. And so if this is the case, right, in combination with the curse on Saul's family and his household, that he would not have a dynasty, right? That the kingdom would be torn from him, as Samuel says. It fulfills that prophecy from Samuel, but it's also, God looks at the heart. He really does. So God knows what's going on here, even if we don't have all the details. So yeah, no, that's great. Okay. And so she had no child until the day of her death. Okay. So that's how that passage in Samuel ends. Now, for our last 5 minutes, we also have something from the Psalms. And so this might surprise you, but there's a Psalm that is probably written to commemorate this event. And so I'm going to show you this Psalm. It's Psalm 132. And it's going to talk about how the ark is proceeding into Jerusalem. I think you'll understand this. It starts with this: Lord, remember David and all his afflictions, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob, surely I will not go into the chamber of my house or go up into the comfort of my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. So we have a poetic description of David's attitude right here in this psalm, that God's ark, God's resting place, I'm not going to rest myself until God has a resting place in Jerusalem or in the capital for the people of God. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of the woods. Found it, the ark, right? Let us go into his tabernacle. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength. Can you see them singing this as they go into Jerusalem? It's kind of neat. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. For your servant David's sake, do not turn away from the face of your anointed. The Lord has sworn it in truth to David. He will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. We have a messianic promise here in the context of the ark coming to Jerusalem, right? If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony, which I shall teach them, their sons also shall sit upon your throne forevermore. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provision. I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout aloud for joy. So that's how Psalm 132 ends. So you get this idea that this is a procession psalm, but I want to zoom in to end here with our kind of our messianic promise, because it's always good to close with where it's Christ, because as we've said multiple times, the Old Testament is the cradle of Christ, or as Luther says, we look for Christ behind every rock, tree, that sort of thing, behind every rock and tree in the Old Testament. This is the big one. He will not turn from it. The Lord has sworn. God can't deny himself. These are God's promises. All of God's promises are yes in Christ. And we have it right here. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. So David is called at times, if you know this, notice that he's called the anointed. For your servant David's sake, do not turn away from the face of your anointed. That's Meshiach. That's Messiah. Okay. David is called a sort of Messiah, right? An anointed one of God. We get this throughout the Psalms. The anointed one shows up. Sometimes it's applying to David, but it's also applying ultimately to David's descendant. So keep that in mind. So for your servant David's sake, do not turn away from the face of your Messiah, is literally how you could translate that. The Lord has sworn in truth to David, he will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne and the fruit of your body. So why is God doing this? God's setting this whole thing up to point to Christ. He's making Jerusalem ground zero for where he will dwell in presence. But where right now it's a tabernacle with the ark, Jesus himself is a walking tabernacle. So think about the context of this. We have David setting up this tent. Eventually there's going to be a temple, and God's ark is going to be in this temple, right? Jesus in John 1:14, which I call as the Christmas verse. We have in John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? In John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or made his dwelling among us. The Greek word there is tabernacled. Okay, so we're here, we have this, this object with God's promises, right? 10 Commandments, the staff. When Jesus walks around, now we have God's presence in a body, in human form, tabernacled among us, okay? Fulfilling everything that was promised in that ark. So it's pretty cool to make these connections and see how this unfolds. God's doing this for a reason. You're getting hints. God's going up to Zion. Jesus literally goes up to Zion and goes up a hill, right? And fulfills everything that's promised there and completes the work of the old covenant here in Psalm 132. So it's neat to read this through that lens. It's so awesome to be a New Testament believer, because there's moments, I said this a few months ago, there's moments when you read the Old Testament, it's like, wouldn't it be awesome to see these events? And these sort of things. But the thing about our perspective and how much greater we have in terms of being able to look at things through this level of perspective. It's awesome. So, all right. Any comments, questions before we break? I'm like right on time here. We're almost exactly at 10:45. Yes, go ahead, Gina.
Why doesn't McCall get second and third and fourth chances? David did, and we all did.
So the question, you're building up pastor sermons in there, right? So that's great. That's a great connection. If you haven't been to worship yet this morning, this is a good segue. There's a few things, and the way I'm going to handle this is, again, looking at the heart. So when David is called a man after God's own heart, the reason is because he humbles himself, right? He humbles himself. She never humbles herself. She's not asking for second chances. She doesn't want to humble herself. You know what I'm saying? And so in other words, why doesn't she get second, third chances? She doesn't want second or third chances. She's not humbling herself and asking for God's mercy, right? She's not. And the other thing is, she's been with David off and on for years. Some of this stuff that's been going on has been, we don't have, I can give you a chronology, and I think I printed one for you a while ago. I can find it again. But some of this stuff's, 20 years into David's reign. This is not in chronological order, neither Samuel or Chronicles. She knows who David is. And she knows who Yahweh is. And so for her to still going out and saying stuff like this, she's kind of, I don't want to say it too crudely, but she's kind of given God the bird a little bit with some of this stuff, if that makes sense. And so she's been stubborn and prideful and all these different things. And so, God opposes the prideful. We know that throughout scripture, right? He opposes the pride. And so it's not so much that she's not getting chances as much as she's refusing to have any chance at all. It would be my take. Does that help? That would be my take on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Just another quick thought, that if she had had children, then what God said, that Saul's line would not continue as his daughter, she would have been part of a lineage of somebody's family,
Right.
and that had to stop. Saul's son Jonathan was killed. That made me sad. But
Yeah.
that had to be.
Right. Yeah. And it's, God, and it's sometimes, again, the one question that you will get to eventually, and I was talking about this morning before we came in, is what's called the cross of the theologian. We have it in Latin too, the crux theologicum, but the cross in Latin, which is, why are some saved and not others? Ultimately, that's the real question we're asking often behind these. Why didn't this person get a second chance? Or why didn't this, when we ask those questions, what we're really asking at its root, if you get to the philosophical issue, is, why are some saved and not others? And that's where we get to the point where we just say, I'm not God, right? Because we know that God, we do have a doctrine of election. God foreordains before all time, before the foundation of the world, as Paul says, believes in Ephesians, that he elects us before the foundation of the world. And yet some are not saved. And yet we know God dies for everybody in the person of Christ. So how do you put all that together? That's called the cross of the theologian. And that's one of the reasons why some people have PhDs and still don't know. Okay, because we're not willing. So here's something you should know. And I want to say this, make sure we're clear on this. And I know Pastor Dinger will back me up on this. We're not Calvinists. So we don't say that God before all time foreordained heaven, hell, heaven, hell, heaven, hell, heaven, hell. That's called double predestination. That is not what we teach. Okay, we teach that that on the cross, Jesus saved everyone, and yet there are some that will not be in heaven with him because they reject what God has done to them. And so when people are saved, it's only because of God. And when people are not saved, it's because of them. Does that make sense? That's what we teach. Now, can you put that in a logical proof with a God who is outside of time and space and matter, and who you try to put that in a logic proof? Okay, so there's going to be a mystery here. There's going to be a point where we are willing to say there is a God and I am not him. And it's okay to say that and be humble and just be grateful for that God has chosen, right? And that you're thankful for your baptism and thankful for the faith created in you, because some of this is mysterious and we don't really truly know sometimes. So that's that's usually the root of the question for me, is why this one and not this one? Like, that to me is the root of that question. Anybody else want to add on?
Learned earlier.
Yeah.
Many places, the term, they hardened their hearts.
Yeah.
God still loves them, but they've hardened their hearts.
Right. And so God says, all right, and that's we're back to the classic. I love that analogy from Pastor Dinger. It's the Burger King, have it your way.
Yeah.
Right. God eventually says, that's the C.S. Lewis. And what it really is, the C.S. Lewis is the great quote on that, the great divorce, right? There are two types of people in the world: those to whom they say to God, thy will be done, and those God says to them, thy will be done. Have it your way. Right. And so in this case, this is Michael McCall, and God's basically saying to her, have it your way. At least that's what we can. We don't know much more about her. So maybe, who knows, maybe in her old age, she repented. We don't know. We can hope for that, right? We don't know. This is all we have. It just says till the end of her life, she didn't have any kids. Maybe when she was 65 years old and seeing David and seeing what was going on, maybe she repented and, worship God. We don't know. We can always hope for that. We have no idea. This is the limited information that we have. So that's the other part of this. All right, let's close in the blessing. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen.